Fáilte Road, you're very welcome to this discussion on international human rights, a tool in the struggle for progress, a discussion organised in partnership with Áras Chonghaile and St Mary's University College Belfast. The panellists taking part in this discussion are Daniel Holder, Deputy Director of the Committee on the Administration of Justice, Andre Murphy, Deputy Director of Relatives for Justice, our chairperson for the talk, Jared McCann, a Senior Lecturer in St Mary's University College Belfast, Tawassul Mohammed, co-founder and representative of the Annika Women's Collective, and Marissa McMahon, an organiser with the Participation and Practice of Rights, better known as PPR. So sit back, buena salt, and enjoy this fascinating discussion around human rights and their role in today's world.
Welcome to this discussion, this panel. We're looking at human rights this evening. The object of this is to try to bring together organisations who collectively work with particularly vulnerable groups, or indeed issues that are pertinent to a rights-based agenda. The work that we do, including myself indeed, in terms of social housing and migration, is really at a cutting edge in terms of promoting human rights. Often you'll find that with the rights agenda, as it has evolved over the years, we have had really a top-down approach to engaging with the rights of the citizens of the population, particularly vulnerable groups. And what over the years, our various organisations and individuals, what we've been trying to do is to try to give agency and purpose to the groups and the individuals who are in a position of needing rights fulfilled, upheld, and developed. So that's basically why we're here this evening. I emphasise this human rights-based approach because it has quite a sort of strong tenure in terms of policy making and legal development, and that by and large comes from the United Nations and the need for the United Nations to try to take rights development out of the hands of effectively state parties or the governments. And where that brings us to is a situation where rights are, by their very nature, needed to be engaged, protest for, developed on the basis of our individual participation to ensure the development of rights and to see the rollout of a rights-based culture. So my background, before we go on to our esteemed panel here, is 25 years working in the homeless sector as a volunteer. I'm an academic by trade. I also have spent about 10 years working particularly with the African community in the north here. And I've also been involved more recently with a project with University College Cork with my colleague Fiona Mohammed, looking at the way in which rights can be promoted through education and indeed in order to develop an understanding that is useful for the organizations that are at the forefront of the promotion of rights. So this evening we will work on the basis of maybe 10 minutes each, and we will work our way around given an idea of the role of our organizations and indeed our own perceptions of what rights are. So maybe we'll start, because you've looked at me. I'll go straight to Daniel there.
I guess. Thanks a lot. Look, so I work for CAJ, Belfast-based human rights organisation. We work with a number of other groups as well. We've set up an equality coalition with Unison, the trade union, that has has PPR, various other sort of groups, particularly working on equality, economic and social rights, that sort of stuff. I was just going to start off by just throwing out a few of the uses of human rights and daily and activist work and things like that, and then maybe reflecting a wee bit on something that was on the title when we sent it out about what happens when a right's not even accepted in law and that sort of stuff. But the overall title was International Human Rights, a Tool in the Struggle for Progress. And I think that's a great title. And they really are a tool, and a tool to do many different things. So one of the things they can do, for example, is international human rights standards can really help legitimize the arguments that groups have, and can be used to get international legitimacy for them as well. So it's one thing for, say, Relatives for Justice or CAJ to rightly throw out and say the British government's legacy proposals that have been put out are totally not compliant with human rights standards, which is clearly true. But when those arguments can get projected and echoed by United Nations experts, for example, or Council of Europe experts, both are things that have subsequently happened, that has far more clout in bringing your arguments to a much broader constituency. It's exactly the same thing that happened, of course, with the work of PPR in relation to, it's one thing, PPR, quite rightly, rights holders notified the sort of housing situation in North Belfast, and that was a total violation of human rights standards. But for you then to have got United Nations experts to produce their own assessment and echo that is incredibly powerful. So it really is a useful tool in legitimizing arguments, but also in getting international and broader recognition for rights, that rights abuses are taking place. So that's one thing. I think another use of international human rights standards is it's really good at weeding out legitimate from illegitimate rights claims, which happen all the time. So, for example, again, we always say, look, as Jared said at the beginning, like human rights standards are the things that are entered into in treaties at the United Nations and Council of Europe. You cannot just make human rights standards up. So it's what's written in treaties and things like that. And to give examples of it, so for example, at the moment, you have a lot of discourse, the ones come in the room with the face mask quite rightly, from a particular sector of sort of right-wing individualists, sort of groups suggesting that having to wear like a face mask is some sort of human rights abuse. Well, is it or is it not? If you look at international human rights standards, the answer is very clearly, well, no, it's not. It's no more. If you, and in fact, if you look where the human rights standards said that having to wear a face mask really is about protecting the rights of others, the right to life of others, the health of others, etc. So actually the onus is on governments to introduce measures to support prevention of the pandemic spreading, and if you have to put a face mask on for a good sort of public health reason, and even you could get a fine for not doing it, how's that any different to, for example, having to wear a seatbelt or a crash helmet, which is something that's well established and no one really calls human rights abuse. But let's localize this a bit more to some of the more ridiculous arguments that get made. It is regularly asserted that having to read Irish on a sign is some sort of human rights abuse, or having to look at a bilingual logo as some sort of human rights abuse. And a very cursory glance at the human rights standards would show that that's absolute and complete nonsense. So human rights standards are useful in that sense to weed out the sort of more ridiculous sort of rights claims from dominant groups that somehow, so you take the Irish language, which faced sort of centuries of discrimination, that somehow it's the dominant group that are facing discrimination, and clearly that's not the case. So that's one usage of it. The other thing is with the international dimension, they're universal. They apply everywhere. They apply to everyone, but plus human rights abuses also tend to be pretty universal. I'm sure a number of the groups in the room get a lot of international engagement and delegations. And the one thing that always strikes you, yes, every situation is unique, but there are so many parallels with practically every other place on the planet, particularly one that's particularly in the context of colonialism or other forms of oppression. You can always sort of draw those things out. And that's why the human rights standards we need here, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, they're no different to many other parts of the planet. To give some examples of that, and return to the issue of minoritized languages, i.e. languages that used to be the main language would have been suppressed and marginalized over the years. I think human rights standards can do is provide a useful blueprint to how to remedy that and provide a steer for the rights holders, in this case, the Irish speaking community or the speakers of minoritized languages, in other places as to what to do. And if you look at human rights standards and how they've evolved, if you take sort of when language rights first started to be taken seriously at the point after the Second World War, remember the human rights law makes this distinction, because again, this is another rights claim that's done in divide and rule of trying to pit indigenous languages against migrant languages, where the rights issues are there for both, but they are very different. For migrant languages, it's very much about equality of access to essential public services. For minoritized languages, it's very much about the preservation and development of the language itself and its speakers. But there's a really good blueprint. At the end of the Second World War, language rights were really much more just about states stopping banning things. Like that was the law, don't ban Irish anymore, don't ban Basque anymore, or whichever language. When you get to the 1990s, they're much more progressively codified into positive obligations, i.e. it's not just about states not doing things, it's about them having to do things, and it's all about restitution. And essentially it's almost a mirror image of turning on its head what was originally done to suppress the language in the first place. So it was banned in the courts, it was banned in street signs, it was banned in education. So what are all the measures about? Restoring and promoting the language within education, putting its visibility back within the public sphere, ceasing to ban it in courts and parliaments and things like that. So it actually provides a useful blueprint for activists to coalesce around, and if they become human rights standards that are adopted by the state, or even legally binding standards where you can go to court if they're not done, that's a way of restoring language rights. And that's of course where we've reached. We've had the soft law standards, whereby governments essentially, there's very little punishment and very little enforcement mechanism for not abiding by them, and they simply haven't worked. So, and things like, if you look, Good Friday Agreement, for example, was absolutely meant to reset the relationship between the Irish-speaking community and move away from the sort of English-only approaches of both colonialism and the Stormont Parliament. It hasn't been that successful because it's impossible to enforce, and therefore for a long time it's been realised it needs to be set in law in an Irish Language Act. So that's another thing. I think another sort of area is how human rights standards can be a very useful tool for exposing rights violations that are happening, and exposing in the way they're happening. And that's partly because of the way, again, human rights law and things like, say, the right for housing has been heavily codified, has become quite detailed over the years as to what that actually means. I mean, the right for housing doesn't mean the state has to provide a house for everyone. That's neither necessary in the context that housing for a lot of people is already sorted. And it was never meant to be the scope of that right. But what does it mean? It means, again, that there are positive duties, like states under an obligation to properly tackle homelessness and to try and supply affordable housing, that sort of thing. But also it has very clear negative obligations about things that states aren't supposed to do. So, for example, let's use a localized example. Let's use some of the North Belfast examples. Like, you can't not build houses in a particular area because, on the basis of objective need, most of the people who are going to live in them are Catholics. And that's the type of thing that actually does happen in terms of public policy decisions. But permission for housing in an area will be refused on the basis that it'll change the makeup of the community, or there isn't community consensus, or this, that, and the other. All of these things are banned under human rights standards. And if they were actually codified into law, those types of practices of gerrymandering and other things would be much more easily challenged. I don't know how I'm doing for time here. I've kind of, I've kind of forgotten. Well, all right, just as a final couple of sentences then. I mean, that is one of the problems. There's bits post-Good Friday Agreement of human rights law that were put into law, the European Convention of Human Rights, which has been which has allowed, particularly in the legacy sphere, huge amounts of litigation and progress on holding the state to account in terms of breaches of the right to life and other human rights standards. But let's not forget that most of what was meant to protect us from the human rights abuses of the past, things I've mentioned, from gerrymandering to suppression of language rights, was never properly put into law. But it was supposed to be. There was supposed to be a Bill of Rights, which was going to be a bit like a constitution and a bit like the European Convention, and that you could enforce rights like the right to housing through the courts and things like that, and that never happened. And in fact, what we ended up with, and I suppose as a final point, it's, yeah, if you don't have the right accepted into law, that's a problem. But even if you do have it accepted into law, it can still be a problem because it doesn't necessarily mean it's realised in practice. You need a legal system and a political system that can actually deliver, and that's certainly not what we've got at the moment. So sure, I'll cut that there.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Well, I have plenty of time for questions after our 4 speakers, so we'll get back on that. Okay, so over to Andre.
Thank you. I suppose what I'd like to do is kind of build on what Daniel has talked about in terms of frameworks and how they can work, and maybe talk about the journey for victims and survivors of the conflict following, well, pre the Good Friday Agreement and following the Good Friday Agreement, and how international law has framed a lot of the developments. So if we think about during the conflict, people who have been affected by violations, and the most egregious of violations, but have faced a system which really used the British state used its sovereignty as a shield. So the actual legal system was framed in a way which prevented redress and recourse. Families met inquest systems, they met a police force, they met all of those investigative mechanisms, and actively prevented them from achieving redress. After the Good Friday Agreement, that was meant to change. So you have the Good Friday Agreement as this human rights framed document. You have victims and survivors who are meant to be one of the main cohorts who will benefit from peace, but they are barely mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement. And how rights are seen following the Good Friday Agreement, and as Daniel has mentioned, how the Human Rights Act is put in place. In some way, for victims and survivors, they have to negotiate that on their own because there aren't special measures for victims and survivors. So we're really unusual in terms of international spheres of conflict, where victims and survivors do not have special measures in terms of remedy and restitution. So families themselves use international law. They go to the European Court. They're the ones who go for the positive obligations of Article 2 of the Human Rights Act. And you have this huge decision made in Strasbourg, right, where they are saying that there needs to be remedy for victims and survivors. That judgment then informs the reform of the criminal justice system. So then it starts to become more responsive to the needs of victims and survivors. Victims and survivors themselves are using the term Article 2 compliance in this really ordinary vernacular. You go into a group and ordinary people will talk about the European Convention of Human Rights and Article 2 and what it means for them. And they go and they litigate on the basis of that. And they change the legal sphere. Meanwhile, politically, victims and survivors are still not being supported. So you have very small, incremental, piecemeal pieces for victims and survivors, the Bloody Sunday Tribunal, the few inquiries on collusion. And that's being done as a confidence-building measure for nationalism. And it's framed as that, rather than meeting the human rights of victims and survivors. Yeah, so you have this legal activism by people who have suffered the most egregious violations during the conflict, and you have a political dynamic of conflict resolution that does not catch up with it. And it really isn't until you start seeing first of all, the Hassel-Sullivan talks, and then particularly the Stormont House Agreement, which starts to catch up with, insert itself into the Good Friday Agreement frameworks, where you start seeing a change. And at last, you start seeing the rights of victims and survivors being mentioned. So it talks about Article 2 compliance within this document. And that is the first time that victims and survivors see their rights being expressed in a political agreement. And that is meant to change the environment completely for victims and survivors, and is absolutely as a result of their own activism, domestically and internationally, and what they have done in terms of bringing their experiences into all of those spheres. And how does the British state react? Well, the British state reacts with delay and with pretense, and it just stands off. And so then it becomes as though that the Stormont House Agreement again becomes contested, and it becomes this political arena for victims' rights to become something that can be politically negotiated, which it was never meant to be. But for victims and survivors, they are still seeing Article 2. They are still using the new mechanisms that are in place. So whether it's the inquest courts with making applications to the new Attorney General to have fresh inquests, whether it's going to the Police Ombudsman's Office, this new accountability mechanism, whether it's, they are taking the lead in terms of that. But we see this stubborn refusal to do something for all victims and survivors that ensures human rights compliance overall. Within the Stormont House Agreement, though, and it's important to notice this, there's even a gap within the Stormont House Agreement. So the Stormont House Agreement talks about this set of rights, but completely ignores women's experience of conflict. So it doesn't take on board CEDAW, it doesn't take on board UNSCR 1325. So women's experience of conflict continues to be neglected. So there's a response then from women who've been affected by conflict, and they're going, here, what about us? And so they start meeting together and they start putting forward, well, what is it that needs to be inserted here? So you see this dramatic response from victims and survivors who are saying, well, women's experience of conflict has been neglected. We don't hear about that. We start to hear, 91% of those killed were men. So then there's an implication in terms of gender experience of conflict. And there's an experience of sexual violence during the conflict that has never been recognized, acknowledged, and needs to be appreciated. And there also starts to be an activism around 1325 that hadn't preceded that. And what does that do then? Women not only are articulating that experience, but they're seeing themselves. They are for the first time saying, well, that was my experience of conflict. And that wasn't just something I just get on with, or I just managed or coped with, or I need a bit of counselling for. That was a violation in its own right. And I have an international human right to assert what that experience was and to assert something for remedy. And so anything that comes now would have to have an appreciation of gender harms as well. So you start to see that the international frameworks allowed for the recognition that the violations had occurred, what Daniel referred to earlier, but then you also see them going, and that isn't good enough. We need to have society appreciate that. We need community appreciating that, and we need to have a legal redress for that. And so one statute or international law or any agreement does not sit on its own. There's always a progress. So the Stormont House Agreement enhances the Good Friday Agreement. And then what we see now is when the British government is coming away from the Stormont House Agreement, when they're saying that they're going to put in place this appalling legacy legislation, it very clearly is the connection, not just to the Stormont House Agreement, but to the Good Friday Agreement itself. Because if we have a peace agreement that is based on human rights, and if we have subsequent agreements that are framed by the Good Friday Agreement, also based in rights, and then the British government reverses on that, they are also reversing in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And that is fundamental in terms of our post-conflict society. How can we have confidence for any agreement? How can we have confidence for the enactment of human rights for any citizen here if we can see the dignity and citizenship of any one of our citizens who have been promised rights, have been promised transformation, being reversed on for political expediency? And there's a lot of lessons in that, there's a lot of threats in that, but what is most important is the people who have been most violated are not putting up with that. Their response isn't to go home. Their response isn't to go back to 20, 25 years ago. Their response is to say never again. Their response is to say, no, these are the international rights. Who can we get to speak out in that? Let's go to the United Nations. Let's go to the European Court of Human Rights. Let's go and try and assert the primacy of law and of these rights. And I think there's something really important about that progress, because while the British government thinks it can reverse those citizens are going nowhere. They have absolutely recognized their place within society, in a post-conflict society with all of these rights, and they are not reversing anywhere. This is where they are. They will demand to be seen in this society as equal, and they will not have their citizenship taken back from them again.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. I think even at this stage, we're starting to see the tension between civil society and state parties and government as such. And I mean, maybe a question that possibly could come up later is in regards to, has that got any better or any worse as the years progress, particularly through our understanding of what rights should be, and indeed the way in which the United Nations had originally framed rights and the responsibility of governments in particular. But the stepping back of government, I think, is something that we discuss. So thank you. Tazawal, could you give us an idea of your work and your understanding of the rights-based approach of your organization?
Yeah, sure. Good evening. I'm one of the team members of Anaka Women's Collective. Anaka is a group for all women, especially women from the refugees and asylum seekers community. We created the group because we have shared struggles. We wanted to create a space where we can support each other. As you might be aware, the Home Office tries its best to create a hostile environment for refugees and asylum seekers. We are tired of watching people suffer while going through the asylum process. I have been through this process myself, and I know how difficult it is. The uncertainty of waiting for a decision on your asylum claim, the racism you face everywhere, being banned from working, although you have the qualifications and the skills, the inhumane housing conditions you are put in, and having to move from accommodation to another, and to move your kids from one school to another every time. We are trying to create a place for mutual aid, an alternative to the hostile environment. We operate on a skill share model. It's important for people in the asylum process who don't have the right to work. It gives them a place to practice their skills and educate others. We are working on a few projects at the moment. I will try to talk briefly about each one of them. We have a gardening group each Wednesday morning with Grow and I at the community garden in North Belfast. We grow vegetables and herbs that are culturally appropriate for our community. This was especially helpful during the lockdown because most people live in crowded accommodation with no gardens or green spaces. We also have weekly drop-ins on Tuesdays when we do various activities. Women bring different skills and educate each other. We sew, we cook, we do English classes and housing clinics. We provide support and advice to new women. And sometimes we just sit down and talk, which is also important for the well-being of people who have difficult times. For example, last Tuesday, I was chatting to this woman and she just casually told me that the journey from her home country to the UK took 10 years. 10 years going through Libya, where all human rights are violated. She finally came to the UK, but during this journey, she lost a brother who drowned trying to cross the sea to Europe, a child who died in Paris because of the poor living conditions, and a sister back in her country. So she finally made it to the UK, and she thought that she's safe. And she is, I mean, in a way, her life is not threatened anymore. But what about her other rights? I mean, she lives on less than 40 pounds a week. She lives in accommodation provided by a private company, NIRS, which is almost impossible to reach. Like, for example, one time her house, there was a water leak in her house. The house was flooded, and I spent hours with her and with migrant help and NIRS just for them to come and fix it. You just go from, they blame each other, and you don't know who is responsible to fix this situation for you. She gets told to go back to her country in the streets. She does all that while taking care of 3 girls. We need actions to change these situations. It's not good enough for local politicians to blame Westminster while doing nothing. We are trying our best to make life better for our community. Another project we are working on is the education project, which started as a response to COVID. When children started online schooling, it was hard for everyone, but more so for people who are not originally from here, because of the language barrier and also because of the isolation. The project included Zoom meetings for mothers to explain the project and the education system in Northern Ireland, weekly Zoom sessions on English and math with volunteer teachers. Some volunteers offered one-to-one support to children. In this project, 30 volunteer teachers participated, and they worked with 80 children, and the results were marvelous. We have seen it week by week. I remember the first day I met this girl, and they just came from Sudan. They came during the lockdown, and she didn't go to an actual school, and she was very shy. It was even difficult for her to talk to the teacher, and she didn't want to do anything. But then you see her week after week building confidence and trying to learn English. So yeah, good results of that project. The last project I will be talking about here is a social enterprise startup with a cultural club in the world. The aim of this project is to create training opportunities and produce food that is wanted by people in the refugees and asylum seekers community. We can provide food that's more affordable. For example, the bread that we are used to eating back home currently comes from other countries. It's frozen and it's expensive. Women in Anaka can make this bread for us and for the wider community. These are the projects we are working on now. We start new projects based on the needs of our group. You can support us by donating money and following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where we put frequent requests for skills donation and support. Also, please keep an eye out for the Lift the Ban campaign that will be launching soon. I don't know if you are aware that asylum seekers are not allowed to work. So people are just sitting there with this less than 40 pounds a week, which is not enough for anything, and yet they are not allowed to work to support their family. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're at the sort of cutting edge in terms of the denial of rights with our migrant population. I've noticed that over the past number of years, there has been a resistance to actually engage the community, the various migrant communities about rights. And indeed, I think that situation is getting worse. Horrendous situations have been developing around the movement of people, and indeed the pushback, which is a horrendous word that's used in regards to people who are fleeing struggle or fleeing conflict or war or poverty, indeed. But that is a an issue, I think, here. We will need to engage, I think, more fully over the coming years. And what will be noticeable next year, I think, will be in regards to the census that's coming up. We had a rough estimation of possibly in the region of about 30,000 from the African community now living in the north of Ireland. Now that sort of shifts the demographics, plus the number of people who are from asylum seeking, refugee, or general migrant new communities that have arrived here, and we need to engage and we need to develop a rights-based approach to what we do with the prosperity and development of these communities. So thank you for that, and we will come back to this indeed. Okay, Marissa, do you want to tell us what PPR have been up to recently?
Not a lot, Chair.
Right, okay.
Let's take the apple cart. Yes, so a lot of it's already been covered coming down this panel here, but PPR was founded, conversation started around 2001. It was founded in 2006, so what's that, about 8 years post Good Friday Agreement by formidable woman whose portrait's hanging downstairs, Áras McCormick, who already seen and probably foresaw and knew that, you know, those most marginalised were not going to feel the dividends of this so-called amazing peace deal, because I've sat in rooms where it is hailed as, you know, the end all and be all, and it might well be on paper, but she was 100% right. And so were the people who started PPR when they were looking at places like North Belfast and things like systemic religious inequality and housing provision, it still wasn't being addressed. Things like mental health provision and access to mental health services. So back in 2006, it started with a group of women in the 7 Towers, and quickly expanded to working across, you know, 3 jurisdictions. Politics mentioned a few of the campaigns like Lift the Ban, Right to Work, Right to Welfare, work with destitute asylum seekers, refugees, all looking at the same thing. Áras used to tell a story about talking to a group of women about human rights and them coming back and saying, she was saying, oh, these belong to you, and a woman was like, that's the best kept leaping secret I've, you know, ever heard. Like, what do you mean, what are they? And it's not something we go into groups and automatically start talking about, but when PPR and Roisin and Shawnee, who were members of the campaign back then 13 years ago, were at my door, they didn't ask you about your human rights, they asked you about your living conditions, and that's when we started to learn that it wasn't normal to be living, breathing in pigeon waste or bathing your child in raw sewage that was coming up your bath, that you were phoning up the housing executive complaining about, and you were being told you have a roof over your head, what more do you want? And you were accepting it. You know, it was about more than that, that there was this framework, that there was all these things that our government has signed up to, or, you know, they were all there and they weren't being felt. So PPR works with and has done, I think, but I'm maybe a bit fast, brilliantly, and working with those most marginalised. And I'm not going to lie, it gets even more and more marginalised, right down to our asylum seeking community who are destitute, who are here and are in total limbo and living in mere accommodation and don't have the first clue about where to even turn for help. So it's it's not a blanket approach either. It depends. I mean, we do some very serious stuff. We also do some, crazy stuff like dressing up and presenting yourself to the housing executive as a superhero, and for a multitude of reasons. But let's be honest, anybody that's working in human rights, it's not easy. You have to have a bit of crack somewhere along the line, but it is quite serious, and it's even more serious when issues that were one of the main issues of and instigated the violence that happened here was religious inequality in housing, and nobody's calling that out. Now, yes, but back then, no. And Áras was often quoted saying, you talked about religious inequality before the peace, you were seen as a supporter of the war, and you spoke about religious inequality post Good Friday Agreement, you were seen as attacking the peace. It was like, let's not talk about all these things that haven't been delivered. So they've worked really hard. Daniel's mentioned quite a few times there about the United Nations. I personally was there in 2016 when it was the second time that religious inequality and housing provision, particularly in North Belfast, was in the concluding recommendations, along with mental health and Irish language rights at that stage were also brought up. The UN High Commissioner has, I said it's human rights at its best and done the way it should be. It's putting it in the hands of those, me at that point, who was living in really shitty accommodation and just accepting that that's the way it is because that's I'm being told by that public authority or by those in power. And it was women reclaiming. It was mainly women. There were some men too, but it was mainly women and kids reclaiming that. And it's spanned out to, when they were at my door, it was about the conditions I was living in. I didn't think about systemic religious inequality and housing provision, right? But then you're at it for a while and you start spotting pieces of land and you're like, Daniel mentioned, why are not building there? That's contested. Okay, so is these 722 children who are currently homeless in this area. So where we're putting them, and it's about challenging, it's moved on about challenging issues of land justice and where that goes. I'm talking specifically here about the housing campaign. I wouldn't even start to talk about the other campaigns because it's not in my area of expertise, but with some class organisers who could talk about it all day long. But what's really important is, and yes, I think it was Bernadette Gavin says, left off, or not even filtered in sometimes the peace agreements is the social, cultural and economic rights of people. And if it is, it's kind of like shoved in there and it's not, enshrined in law or it can't be legally challenged. So, and we're thinking, so we've went from one end of the scale to dressing up as a superhero, presenting yourself as a housing executive, to taking a judicial review, and everything in between. And along the way you learn, and you learn that, power responds and you have a right to hold power accountable and getting that, like, there's something about when you finally there's something about finally realizing that, right, okay, I get it. I get it. I don't have to be living like this. I deserve better. Our new communities coming in and being treated beyond appallingly in this, already having come through God knows what type of situation they arrive here and then be treated like that all over again. And you're trying your best and you're not getting anywhere in a system that's fundamentally flawed and broken. And in particular the housing system, I mean, we deal with it day and daily. It has been broken for so long. That you can't take people seriously when they say, oh, we're upholding the agreement, because they're not. And again, you can talk about equality till the cows come home. If there's no action around that, if there's no, if you're not putting it into the terms of somebody living in a hostel for 7.5 years, waiting on a home in West Belfast, being told, oh, it's our area, I need, just have to accept that. If you can't put it into, their day and daily, as you say, you were saying about people using the articles and standing up and saying it, people going, it's my right to have, a proper heating system. It's my right. It's when you're hearing people using that type of language and asserting their rights for themselves, and that we never advocate on behalf of anybody or any group or any person. When power, and they often do invite us to the table, it's families there. Ines always said, you're the expert in your own situation. I don't know what it's like to have no heating in my house, or mold, or pigeon waste. You do. So you talk about it. And there's that dynamic when you shift that, when you're in a room. And as I say, we've done some mad stuff in between, but we scraped off a little mold one time and just set it around the room that we were in. And the officials were like, oh, what's that smell? And that's what we're living in, and that's what our kids are breathing in. And it's awful, isn't it? So say the next time we phone up and you tell us it's sorry to have a roof over your head, they'll maybe think twice, when it's about making people feel uncomfortable, because they should. They should feel uncomfortable if they're happy enough to let people and let people's rights be totally obliterated while they tell you that they're giving you enough. I probably talked way too much, have I? Somebody stopped me somewhere along the way.
Stop the 10 minutes.
Good. Well warned, but no doubt we're going to come back to this, and what did I want to say? No doubt we're going to come back to this. I have something else to finish on there. Doesn't matter. I'll come back to me. Sorry. Because I'm not Daniel for the answer going. But what was I going to say?
Okay, thank you. just one quick thought on that. Years ago, I looked back at the sort of housing policy here and the changes in it over the years and the way in which the likes of Stormont administration would have dealt with housing. 1939, there was an initiative to end homelessness in Belfast in particular. I'll just say that again, in 1939, and we're now in 2021.
44,000 people on a housing waiting list, half of which are considered homeless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where we're at. So thank you. And I think we'll maybe go straight to questions and open it up to the floor in regards to this. Okay, so.
Hi, Sean. It's just everyone on the panel. Do you think the media is balanced for what you're putting forward? Do you think it's balanced in the way that some programs make jokes about the Irish language and things like that on the media? I'm just wondering, how do you see yourselves making how you put it, for the future, making your points more relevant for the hearts and minds of people?
Okay, thank you. In regards to the media and the way in which we can put forward these issues, I think in that particular question, I'll defer to Andre as our resident journalist, if it's okay.
Well, I think that's there's a few things that happen around rights, right? That's really important. What they try to do is some sort of balancing thing, pretending something is balanced rather than presenting something as right. So what they'll do is they'll say, here we have a person who's talking about the right to truth and the right to justice about the killing of their loved one. And then we hear, on balance, the person who doesn't, right? So or there's a false equivalence. And there will be this false equivalence that's often done, particularly with victims and survivors, where they'll say, this person's experience of conflict has to be balanced with another person's experience of conflict. And what that ends up doing is negating both of them, rather than talking about the right in its own way. And I think that can be really, really toxic. And oftentimes, rather than, for instance, on a day like today, where we could be talking about whether the PSNI is actually human rights compliant, what we will see the media doing is sort of a sort of pretense around what has happened around policing over the past 20 years, rather than engaging with some really difficult questions around policing. And I think that has been unhelpful at times. Now, I'll say this also, within the past 20 years, some of the most important work done around exposing policies and practices of collusion has been done by some of the investigative journalists. So if we think about some of the John Ware programs, if we think about some of the stuff done by Barry McCaffrey, Trevor Burney, Sean Murray, those things have been really, really important and actually led to important developments in a wider sense. But on the day-to-day kind of way that victims and survivors are just thrown out there to try and elicit tears, elicit a bit of sympathy, but never actually, and always presented as, this is a toxic issue. One experience cancels out the other. That can be really, really demoralizing over a period of time.
Okay. Maybe to throw in a few thoughts. I mean, there's some great journalistic work out there, but at the bad end of media and things like that, I mean, you quite right, this constant sort of attempt to find the middle ground between reasonable and unreasonable is quite often irritating, and you see that in a lot of rights debates. I mean, on the Irish language stuff, it's a constant bugbear that there's a focus in on a tiny element of politics around the Irish language, and it's a focus on some people who would promote the Irish language, and there's a complete ignoring of the decades and centuries of all the politics around suppressing and marginalizing the language. That's just completely missed out of the discourse. But I suppose there's a much broader point, and when you get to the worst of the media, and particularly the sort of British tabloid press, and I know it echoes political voices, but it's done its own work as well. And there's a much broader point about how we all need to tackle in our anti-prejudice work about how when a particular group or community is demonized, that creates the climate and facilitates the climate where their rights will be abused. So if you, well, let's take West Belfast as a community and take the British tabloids not that long ago, and the way it demonized the community and created a climate where rights could be abused. But let's bring that much more up to date in terms of, for years now, migrants and refugees have been demonized to an extent that within the British context, and it hits here as well, a set of policies as horrific as the hostile environment that leads to white, as we saw with Windrush, the widespread racial discrimination, but also that just abuses rights at every level, bans people from working, bans people from adequate living conditions, things like that, tries to turn every public servant into essentially an immigration officer, moves the border away from the border into the housing office, into the employment office, into everything else. How a really totalitarian set of racially discriminatory policies generally have quite a lot of political support, and that's quite not among us, obviously, and therefore they're tolerated, even though they lead to shocking human rights abuses. And as you said, it's something we've seen some pushback now from Stormont and some of the powers it has. The Communities Minister recently refusing to include in a sort of Home Office agenda of trying to get sort of housing officials to pass information to the Home Office to facilitate deportations and things like that. But there needs to be a lot more done. It's actually something we're doing a bit of work on, drawing out the different powers that are devolved here vis-a-vis what the powers the Home Office has as to what more can be done. But going back to the question, yes, the role of the media and discourse is very important, but that demonization thing really does create a climate where rights can be abused, and is something what we always need to try and be on top of.
Absolutely, thank you. I mean, that idea of othering that states are so familiar with now is, I mean, it's verges on criminal, indeed dips into that criminality. And I'm thinking of the way in which migrants coming across the Mediterranean are treated. And a statistic sort of hits me in regards to that, and that was the 800 lives that were lost in was it April 2015, and we tolerated that. It didn't reach the news. It didn't reach the sort of the political level to engage with that. And as I say, we tolerated that in this society, and othering kills. I mean, we know that, and our establishment, if we could put it that way, seems to continue in that vein. And it is dangerous. It's a dangerous road to go down. Okay, another question. Oh, yourself.
First of all, Gurm Weigel, that was a very informative and passionate contribution each has made. I think each one of them could probably do a session on themselves. But just to Daniel, given the difficulties that the Bill of Rights is facing at the minute, in relation to the All-Ireland Charter of Rights, is that dependent on a Bill of Rights being in place first, or can that be developed independently of a Bill of Rights in the North?
Okay, so within the Good Friday Agreement, there was this provision for a Bill of Rights which would be legally binding in the North, and would introduce, and it was obviously meant to complement the European Convention, so it would be economic and social rights. And then there was a separate provision for a Charter of Rights for the whole of Ireland, which has never been implemented. There was a sort of bit of a blueprint, but its status of it is quite up in the air. It's not that solid in the sense it was meant to be a sort of declaratory charter signed up to by political parties rather than something that would be legally binding, could be enforced and that sort of thing. So that's where it actually sits. I mean, if you had and there's no reason for it I suppose to answer your question, there's no reason for it to await a Bill of Rights. No, it could be taken forward in advance of it, or concurrently or whatever. It's not dependent of it. The broader thing you're meant to have, though, would be a Bill of Rights in the North and then equivalents in the South of a lot of those rights in terms of legal enforceability. And it's no surprise that without that, you began to have, particularly with the DUP in power, a lot of patterns of some of the same types of abuses that had occurred in the past re-emerging, things like the gerrymandering in North Belfast and all that sort of thing occurred that couldn't have happened if a Bill of Rights was there. And even things like sort of last year blocking using a veto that had been introduced at St Andrews that completely conflicts with the veto that was meant to be under the Good Friday Agreement. So under the Good Friday Agreement, you're meant to have the petition of concern. It was never meant to be just a political veto. It was meant to be that measures in the Assembly this was to stop majoritarianism and sort of abusive laws whereby measures in the Assembly that breached human rights, which was breached the ECHR, or breached the Bill of Rights. You can't really use it properly without a Bill of Rights, would not be lawful, i.e. wouldn't get through the Assembly and wouldn't become law. And the petition of concern that was in the Assembly was meant to be used for that purpose, but it wasn't. It was never implemented properly. It just became a veto, and because its use became into disrepute, it stopped. But at the time of St Andrews, the whole intention of the agreement was just further turned on its head by the introduction, and this was the sort of the DUP blueprint of when they moved into the First Minister's office, of instead a different type of veto, whereby no minister was allowed to take a decision that was significant or controversial. Like, I don't know what insignificant decisions to take, but it basically meant that everything was subject to a political veto by the larger parties. And in this case, it's only really the DUP that have used it. So it just creates, it actually creates a political system whereby the opponents of rights and equality have disproportionate power, and rights commitments can't be delivered. So if you take things like the anti-poverty strategy that's a legal duty under St Andrews, we took a case in 2015, won the judicial review that the executive had acted unlawfully in not adopting it. There wasn't the political will there. It was Paul Given, in fact, who was the minister to implement it, didn't really take anything forward. Then there wasn't an executive. Now you've actually got an executive minister in communities who does have the political will to take it forward, has done a blueprint, has done an expert report and things like that. That doesn't mean it will actually get adopted because of this veto, which just means everything can be vetoed. We've got, so just trying to, I had a list somewhere of all the times this had been used, but it's been, so instead of a veto, which was the intention under the Bill of Rights, being used to block measures that abused rights, you've actually got a veto being used that block measures that promote rights. So it's been used, and I do have the list here, it's been used to veto a new system to replace the 11+. It's been used to veto local government boundary reform, which obviously engages the gerrymandering issue. This was at first. It's been vetoed to block marriage equality proposals. It's been used to veto marriage equality proposals. It's been used to veto Irish language proposals. It was used 3 times last year to block provisions for women's reproductive rights in terms of abortion services, and then it was quite publicly used to block COVID regulations by Edwin Booth. So you've got a situation whereby the intention that there would be some sort of human rights scrutiny of decisions as a safeguard has been completely flipped to one whereby the opponents of rights and equality can just veto and block everything, and that's why nothing is working and the system is totally dysfunctional as it stands. It's a long answer. But the short answer is no. Cheddar rights can go ahead without cheddar rights.
I think you were right in regards to spending a bit more time on each of these. And one word came up which I think we could maybe revisit another date, and that's Brexit and the implications of Brexit. But we'll leave that for another occasion.
The big
Okay.
word.
Yeah. Right. Another question. Yes, Finn.
I just wonder, just based on what you have just said, Daniel, and what Marisha actually said very passionately, I wonder what the panel thinks about whether in fact we should be leaving change, political change, human rights change, adherence to human rights to Stormont, and whether we should be encouraging people to develop their own agency on the ground, to argue the case, to make people aware of the issues, because a lot of people aren't aware of the issues, to make people aware of their rights, and to make people aware of the tools that may exist whereby they can advance those rights. Because one of the difficulties that it seems to me that exists is that when the Good Friday Agreement is saying that people felt that now it's up to the politicians to build a peace. And there are a number of organisations like your own, and Daniel's as well, who have been trying to advocate on behalf of rights at a civil organisation level. I'm just wondering if you think there's enough organisations like that, and if we want to see more organisations, we need to see people feeling, be given the confidence to actually stand up and say, we're going to do this ourselves.
Thank you, Phelim. I think the question essentially is about encouraging people to claim their rights, just that agency of sort of seizing your rights or
Well,
engaging with.
In some ways, I think people became disempowered when understanding was created, because people aren't giving the power to the politicians and expectations to the politicians. And we already know that there are problems with trying to develop change in Stormont. We've already been alluded to by ourselves, actually. Video is one way, but the fact that you have power sharing with 5 different political parties with different agenda, and that's not even including the political constituencies that they're trying to appeal to. Some of those constituencies which are openly listed within sectarian and openly opposed to any sort of change. So in that context, trying to depend on Stormont to bring about real change seems to me going down a dead alleyway. That what we really need is the development of civil society organisations that are arguing the case. I feel like some of what these are doing already, but we need more arguing the case, making people aware that there are issues, because the vast majority of people don't know these issues exist, don't really understand what direct provision is all about, don't really understand about racism that's taking place in this particular society, don't realise some of the issues. I mean, I heard about an issue today from somebody not sitting very far away from me. You know, I didn't even know about that particular issue. There's so many different issues as in these legacy issues. There's so many things that the vast majority of the population are not aware of in terms of abuse, in terms of denial of human rights. And it seems to me that we need to be encouraging people, giving them the confidence, empowering them to stand up on their own 2 feet or their own many feet, in groups, and advocate for change. And that means, and so that's all I'm trying to put it to yourselves, to encourage your work, but also to try and get other people to do something similar on a whole range of other levels. Instead of being cowed.
Yeah, Marissa, if you want to deal with that, but essentially it's about encouraging civil society to be active in regards to sort of taking the rights.
I'm not thinking that somehow you're challenging the peace.
Yeah.
Because of course you're challenging the peace.
Yeah.
Because it's a struggle. Human rights is a struggle. I'm not talking about going to throw stones and batter bombs. I'm talking about human rights is a struggle. So you are challenging the peace, you're challenging the status quo, and we should be proud that you are challenging the status quo, and we should be proud of encouraging other people to do the same, because that's what brings about a better society.
Okay. Marissa?
Yes, Phil, well, just on that point, this is my next, we're going to plug our next event. I've always wanted to say it. But no, seriously, in terms of like, challenging the status quo, that was one of the titles that we had back in June, but it's now like join the conversation, like join this conversation about these thousands of people. Like there's a hostel, stone throw away that I worked in and out of from here, and people that are homeless, living in a homeless hostel, were not considered homeless. Work it out for me, make it make sense, because I couldn't make it make sense, and I was at this job for 5 years. They were entitled to FDA, free duty applicant, they weren't entitled to homeless status. They're going, okay. Any wonder our system is fundamentally flawed. What more have you to do to be recognised as homeless? How much more homeless can you be than living in a homeless hostel? It made 0 sense to me, it made 0 sense to the people who were in there. And that's when you get people talking, and it was quite easily challenged in a way. You know, it was quite easily brought to the attention of, and I'll tell you, it was Deirdre Hardy, who was in the council at the time, and she brought it forward as a motion and things like this. So, but that started with the conversation. So our next webinar, it's actually, fingers crossed, all being well with COVID, is part of it's in person in the Mac Theatre. And to join the conversation, we've been working with the TCPA over in England, with Queen's, with Rory Hearn, with all these people who have all these ideas, and we've been working and plugging away with civil society. But again, the amount of people who don't know, I'm in this organisation, and sometimes I'm even shocked. I'm like, oh, I don't know. And ignorance is bliss sometimes, and education is a big thing. But going back to your point, how do you make change if you have absolutely no clue? If you've never been in the shoes of that person, or even have the slightest notion of what that person's went through, how can you effectively, change their situation? You can't. I don't care what anybody says. You can't. There has to be some type of, look. I'm not saying like our politicians aren't empathetic, and there's some class ones. There's also some absolute. Look at them like you're running the country. Oh my God. Okay, gives me hope. Gives me hope one day. But if they get there for a reason. But they're definitely not the end. They can't be the hope, because they've been there, they've changed, things have changed for what, 20, many years? Too many years after the Good Friday Agreement. We were homeless in 1939, and we're now at probably one of the highest rates of homelessness in these 6 countries, and it's one of the richest places in the world, isn't it? Supposedly. What are we doing wrong? So yes, I think more of this should be happening. More people affected, more people on the margin should be part of the change. Otherwise, what is the point? And if you look at the things that have changed on this island, north and south, women's bodily autonomy, equal rights to marriage, that's feet on the street. That's people going, we've had enough of this, carry on, like, I'm done. Let's make change, and it's didn't happen overnight. It was people plugging away for years and years and years and decades sometimes, and that's where we're at in the housing situation. We're not just taking it, no, that's contested land. We can't put homes there. Right, okay. When you tell these women I'm working with in the hostel why they can't have a home there, or, and they're standing up and they're asserting that we're not taking over an answer. So, yes, and whenever you start that, can you give us a ring? Because we'll definitely be part of that. Whatever that looks like, wherever it looks like, but I think more of it needs to be happening. And it's happening in wee small bits right across this island. It is, people.
We are doing it in our groups. We are claiming our rights, and we are trying to do the best we can to improve the living conditions of our group and people in our community.
I think it was really instructive what happened when the Stormont collapsed, where you saw this explosion from civic society around the denial of rights, and people were taken to the streets in terms of the language, in terms of reproductive rights, in terms of legacy, that there was almost like people were unleashed, and you saw this huge conversation about it being about rights. It had collapsed under the weight of the denial of rights. It was put back together because people need administration, and there was a demand around administration. But if the denial of rights continues, then it really speaks to Stormont being unworkable, and what we have not working in a very fundamental way. I think it's really instructive that is a grassroots response then, because, that isn't a top-down thing. And I do think that there's something about how the Good Friday Agreement, for the best will in the world, constructed all things, and it keeps happening with all kinds of agreements and political negotiations, that we'll put a commissioner in for something, or we'll put a little forum in for something, right? And they're always like people who are the great and the good, who become these gatekeepers and stop exactly your conversation, right? Where you get someone who has mold growing on their wall to come into a room. The commissioner is there to make sure you don't do that. Do you know what I mean? The commissioner is there to, and I do see it as a post-colonial, it's a modern form of that. You put in someone with a CBE or an OBE after their name, and they come in, they're going to speak on behalf of the people who are already very active, already have voices, already have agency. Why on earth did the victims of institutional abuse need a commissioner? One of the most active organizations, and for creating huge political change. Why did they need a commissioner? Because they were uncomfortable. When they walk into a room, they make everyone feel really uncomfortable, because what they talk about is really difficult, and we have failed them. and they have every right to be angry, and they have every right to be traumatized, and we just feel uncomfortable with that. So we'll appoint somebody nice over here who's a bit nicer to listen to. And they're the sort of things that happen instead of actual change. We get a commissioner, we get, look at the payment scheme, a really, really fundamental thing that happened where people who were injured had absolutely the right to reparations, as did the bereaved of the conflict. We didn't talk about reparations. Instead, we talked about a benevolent program that was set up by the British government. Aren't they really nice to victims and survivors? We'll bring in this program for the injured, and isn't it absolutely great? And what they're able to do in this benevolent program is bring in systemic discrimination against former prisoners, against the bereaved. And they were able to do all of that because it wasn't rights-based, it wasn't about the right to reparation. And they're the things that keep on happening instead of actual rights compliance.
And you were going
Yeah.
to say something there?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think the more people involved in activism, the better, and that is the sort of key for change, because I think everyone who's involved in this at whatever level is pretty exhausted for one thing, with all the micro battles everyone has to fight every day on a whole sort of range of issues. But plus, I know, Jared, you're keen to sort of internationalize some of this discussion a bit. If you look in other places like Latin America over the last couple of decades, where you have seen significant bits of change, at time or right, it's facing a bit of a backlash and a bit of a resurgence as well at the same time over more recent years. But you have seen sort of more mass mobilizations being key to that, and that eventually shaping and changing systems of power. And yeah, it's been mentioned by a few people. We're well back in an era of civil rights mobilizations here, whether it's for women's reproductive rights, marriage equality, Irish language, sort of truth over legacy issues. Those mobilizations have been happening in recent years, but the more of it, the better. It really is the key to getting lasting change.
Thank you. We're maybe coming to the end of this discussion. We'll maybe just take one more question, if there is one more question from our audience here, and then we'll just finish up with a quick comment from each of our panel. So, anyone? Okay, we'll.
Can I just give an answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just came here, but I am a member of Sinn Féin, and I have to say that there's not a day I'm not in one of the constituency offices, and people are there, volunteers working constantly, and working all the time for people's rights, no matter who calls in. Like, should it be welfare, should it be housing? I kind of can't sit and say nothing, because they are working constantly. Maybe there's not enough people helping them out, but that is what's happening. I actually came here. I work for a project, still a prison project, and it's for ex-prisoners. And I feel a bit humble listening to, when you're kind of waking back to the past, but it's for ex-prisoners with drug addictions and with mental health issues who can't talk to statutory agencies because they have a duty to report what they are being told. But this is leading on to something else. There's a group of volunteers around this. Quishta had asked us to get involved in a project of interviewing people who had been up to the jails during the whole time of the conflict. And it was around things that were gifted, like harps, handbags. But when we interviewed them, and I have to say it was mostly women that interviewed them, and it was mostly women that were being interviewed. And we know about what prisoners went through. We know about what women on our mom went through. But it's strange, and it's something that Andrea had said that had brought it to mind. When we were doing the interviews, every woman that's done an interview talked about, what had happened, how the person that they were going up to visit had went into jail. But they started talking about going up on visits. And most of the women were my age, they were maybe 50, 60. And there were very young girls then, and they talked about the searches getting into the jails. And every single one of them started crying. And then it clicked on me because I was one of them women. And you were going, you were only 16 and 17. And these searches, you were being abused. And you knew there was something wrong, but it came from a generation that was very innocent. So you didn't know what was happening to you. And it clicked with every one of them women that were being interviewed. And it was just whenever Andrea touched on about what women had been through, that brought it to mind. I'm going off on a whole run. I just got off on a whole rant.
That's really valuable, Loretta, you know,
Yeah.
because if we, you know, that visibility of
Yeah.
abuse and violation is so
And
important.
it never clicked until they actually spoke about it. They were saying, you know, you went up to the searches and then stopped, and then they went, you know, it was terrible. And I think that's the first time they realized it, and I think it was the first time that they really spoke about it.
And it's really instructive that the first place demolished in the Kesh site was the visits,
Yeah,
right? So what that did was say all of those, particularly women who went up for all of those decades and had all of those experiences, was physically demolished and was not appreciated.
yeah,
Where, you know, they kept a block, they kept a cage, they kept the hospital, the visits were taken away, and that was really gendered. And in Crumlin Road, the visit is turned into the foyer.
Yeah.
And again, it's taking away that whole experience.
yeah.
Just a comment as well, Gerard, if that's okay.
Yeah, Karen, go ahead.
In terms of the Áras story and even Thomas's story and Marissa's and all of the human rights issues that you mentioned tonight. We're talking about, you know, kind of mobilizing civic society to try and kind of stand up and have those voices, and it's massively important, and I hugely commend the work all of us do. I think one of the ways in which we can do it is telling the stories, is vocalizing it, whether that's over a cup of tea at a drop-in clinic or at a counselling, but you know, at a session where those things are being discussed. I think vocalizing those things is hugely important, and I think actually that's the way forward. That if we can draw our communities in and make them relatable and humanize them, because you get loads of statistics, you get 44,000 and things like that, but it's quite easy to ignore a statistic as a generalization, I suppose, for lack of a better word. Whereas I think actually the humanization and the more personal aspect of things will allow us to sort of tap into people and to awaken that need in them to fight for all of our rights, and for people who can't vocalize it, who can't do that going forward. So I actually think conversations like this are hugely important, and hopefully when it is shared, obviously we're recording it this evening, I think that will help. But and I know from personal experience from the language point of view that it wasn't until it was really publicised, and I maybe became slightly more vocal with the more private sector. I would have in previous jobs been quite quiet, believe it or not, and I wouldn't have sort of mentioned things like that much, you know, because it's a personal thing. And actually, when the really blatant, you know, discriminatory language that was used in a public forum by people who were supposedly represent people, and then I became slightly more vocal in those circles, people were going, oh, I just thought they were giving out a bit of Irish language, you know, people, and I was thinking, but I am one of them, that's me. And it was only then that those people who would have no other people in those circles, who had no personal knowledge of it, actually went, oh, right, okay, that maybe isn't right, isn't it true? So I think the personalization and the humanization of those personal stories are the way forward to tap in. So I think my point is that what you're doing, even with taking parts in an event like this, and vocalizing those things, is massively important. And I think that'll be the way forward in terms of motivating civic society to stand up.
I think, thank you for that. I think if anything, what we have here is to start a conversation. And indeed, with COVID, what has happened over the past couple of years, I think there's almost a new environment opening up. And I think it's at this point, we need to re-enter the conversation around rights and what rights actually mean. And indeed, confront the administrations that are stepping back from rights. And I'm thinking in particular, the way in which migrant people have been treated, the way in which our former prisoners are being treated and victims are being treated right across the board here. I'm from an international perspective, and with a different hat on from the sort of the development studies as a discipline, where I come out of. We're looking at the privatization of war, where governments have handed over conflict to mercenaries effectively, so that they can step back from any sort of rights obligations. We have the use of drones, for example, again, stepping back from rights and trying to keep the people who are trying to escape these conflicts, trying to keep them out of safe zones or safe areas, and the denial of rights that comes with that, because effectively that is what they're about. And that is an agenda for the future. I think it's something that, as I say, is a conversation that we can continue, and hopefully we'll develop this as we go on. So just to maybe conclude, I'll ask our panel maybe if they could take a minute or two just to summarize the key points and messages you want to put forward.
Yeah, see, just beforehand, can I just say that without a doubt, many, if not, the majority of our politicians do work hard, especially on the ground. A lot of them you do see, and I've been sitting in many an office asking, "Can you help me write a letter?" But more around what Daniel said, it's that you get so far and then there's a veto or there's just, it's black. It doesn't make sense. So, and when we were talking about things boiling down the political will, sometimes it is people just totally denying, some certain parties totally denying rights, and it's others pushing so far and then being stopped. So,
I just want to say that I am proud of the work we are doing at ANASA, and if you come to the Tuesday drop-ins, you can feel it, you can feel the support, you can see how women are coming together and facing all the challenges together. So it's a growing community, the refugee and asylum seekers community. And I just want to say that we are here and we are staying. So it's better to be part of the community instead of being excluded and then creating more problems. We can participate and we can give this community or our skills and qualifications.
Okay. I
suppose as we're sitting tonight, we know that we're waiting any moment, any day. We can have legislation introduced that will be an absolute derogation from all standards of international law, and it's going to be introduced by the British government, and it's going to provide amnesty across the board. And it'll be under a government that doesn't care a jot for international standards, international reputation, and where it stands in terms of international law. For the people who are going to be affected by it, it's going to close down all of the remedy and all of the work that I was speaking about earlier on. And yet victims and survivors will find a way through in terms of ensuring their story is told, ensuring that it's recorded, and also ensuring that when the time turns, because the time will turn, they will secure a remedy. And that tenacity is ever inspiring for us.
Okay. Daniel, Ryan?
There's not much to add to what everyone else is saying, apart from echoing, even echoing the original point as well, and the recognition that there are lots and many political activists who go in political parties who work extremely hard day in, day out. But it must also be extremely frustrating when effectively there's a political system installment that allows one particular constituency to veto everything, but every political party gets blamed for it when they're not actually wielding the veto. That must just be incredibly frustrating. So I think that's an important point. I'm trying not to mention that B word, the Brexit thing, but I mean, it is part of, we know, and you've just mentioned that we're really up against it at the moment in a lot of senses, with a British government that is in full Donald Trump mode, without any sort of doubt about it, is trying to dismantle numerous forms of accountability, is gutting the peace agreements rather than implementing them fully, which is what we would want to see happen is trying to stop even themselves being accountable to judges, is trying to gut human rights act, all those sort of things. So we are really up against it. The pandemic's an appalling experience, and you'd have hoped at least that it would have provided a springboard for a push for more radical change, and that's something everyone's going to have to be engaged with and work on. But I think it is pretty much the same message that we have to push on and ultimately prevail. And there's lots of activists doing a lot of work to that end, and may it continue.
Thank you. Well, I think that's effectively an agenda for the foreseeable future for all of us. Can I just thank our panel, thank our audience.